There are 4 phases on the journey to becoming an exceptional critical thinker, as we described in the critical thinking roadmap. What I found though in my experience is that people often get stuck in between those phases. If you were to think of this roadmap to exceptional critical thinking as an ascent or an incline, these barriers to critical thinking act as plateaus where people settle in and they get stuck there. Some people actually for their whole careers just operate on a certain plateau, and that holds back their productivity, the impact that they're able to create, and it holds back their professional development, actually undermining their professional development. In this video, what I want to do is describe those plateaus, those 3 plateaus, and I'm just going to give you a brief look at some research that can help you or your team members get out of that plateau and continue climbing again. So the first one, it exists between the execute phase and the synthesize phase. Execute is about doing what you were told to do, while synthesize is about identifying what's important and combining the information to give it meaning and interpret it. The plateau that exists there is what I call the ownership plateau. Ownership has to do with taking responsibility for your work and the outcome of your work. In the execute phase, you don't need ownership. You're doing what you're told to do. The focus is on the instructions and carrying out what you've been asked to do. When you get into synthesis, though, then it becomes important because synthesis is rarely asked for. Rarely do people ask you to sort through all this and make sense of it. No, it's just implied that you would do that. And so that's why you have to take ownership for it. You have to care about the end result. The example I like to give is a dentist who is asked, by a patient to take out an infected tooth. When that dentist goes in for surgery and is taking out the tooth, what they find is that 2 teeth away from there's another infected tooth that the patient didn't know about. A dentist who is operating out of the execute phase, is going to take out the tooth that was requested and do nothing about the other tooth, even though they know it needs to be removed. They don't mention it, they don't do anything about it, because they are not taking ownership for the quality of the outcome of their work and the impact that they have. When you want to move someone from the execute phase and over top of the ownership plateau, you want to look at things like the endowment effect, which is how you instill and create ownership. You want to look at research on how Toyota and other Japanese automakers cultivated and empowered their employees on the front lines of the assembly lines. And you want to look at what's called the culture of commitment, or the commitment culture, which was one of 4 cultures that researchers identified in startups, and which led to incredible levels of success that far outpaced their peers. So those are 3 places of research that will help you or your team members begin to overcome the ownership plateau. The second plateau is what I call the egocentrism plateau. It has to do with only being able to see things from one point of view or one perspective, and it exists between the synthesize phase and the recommend phase. In the execute and the synthesize phase, you're basically assuming that what you're working with is right. When you think about the execute phase, your focus is on carrying out instructions, which you implicitly assume are correct. In the synthesize phase, you're dealing with information, or you're gathering the information from which you then make sense of. In it, you're implicitly assuming that the information that you have is right. So when you get to the place where you want to move on to the recommend phase, your natural assumption is that how you're seeing things, the way in which you're interpreting things, is right. And that will undermine your ability to make strong recommendations. Because to recommend, you need to be able to consider alternative options. You need to investigate weaknesses in your own opinion, and you need to honestly and objectively assess the strengths of alternatives. When it comes to understanding how to move over the egocentrism plateau and make strong recommendations, you want to look at research on egocentric bias, confirmation bias, and empathy, because those are going to help you begin to see the world and see things from other perspectives, which will allow you to make strong recommendations. The third and final plateau is the creativity plateau. and it keeps people from moving from the recommend phase into the generate phase. If you think about it, up until this point, you've been mainly focused on improving and taking information and taking it to the next level. That's what synthesize is about. That's what recommend is about. It's taking the next step. It's taking what you have and building off of that. When you get to the generate phase, it's really about creating something out of nothing. The best way I like to explain it is the difference between the painter Gustave Courbet, who was a naturalist realist painter, and Picasso, who at least later in his career was an abstract or painter of cubism. Gustave Courbet in his paintings was taking what existed in the world around him and conveying it and replicating it onto the canvas. Whereas Picasso is actually imagining new things. The things he was painting weren't things that existed around him. It was entirely new objects and depictions of things. That is what creativity and the generate phase is about. It's about coming up with something that is different and distinct from what has existed before. And to be fair, that's not always necessary. That's the value of the recommend phase. You can provide strong recommendations based on what has been done before. The challenge is when you're dealing with problems that are intractable, that haven't been solved before, or you're wanting to achieve something that hasn't been achieved before, or at a pace that hasn't been achieved before, or at a scale. That is when you need to operate in the generate phase, and when you can't get stuck in the creativity plateau. To learn how to get up and above the creativity plateau, you need to understand the two primary creative processes. You also would benefit from looking at the work and processes engaged in by Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and Mark Zuckerberg. In particular, if we look at how the ideas for their world-changing businesses came about, it was probably different than you think. So you can draw inspiration there. To become an exceptional critical thinker, you need to get up and over these three barriers that create plateaus in our critical thinking: the ownership plateau, the egocentrism plateau, and the creativity plateau. Hopefully this video gave you at least a preview of where you might be getting stuck, where you're stuck already, or where some of your team members are stuck, so that you can begin to get them up and over these plateaus and move them on to exceptional critical thinking. Obviously, there's a lot more we could say about each one of these, which we will hopefully do in other videos. But thank you for watching this video. If you found it valuable, please like it below and subscribe. And thank you again for watching this video.